Thank you so much for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Kim, and I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. Before we get started, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website, powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Nick Flynn and Victoria Redel. Nick Flynn is the author of 3 previous memoirs, including the Penn Joyce Osterwheel award-winning Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, and 4 volumes of poetry. A professor on the creative writing faculty at the University of Houston, he lives in Brooklyn, New York. When Flynn was 7 years old, his mother set fire to their house. The event loomed large in his imagination for years, but it's only after having a child of his own that he understands why. He returns with his young daughter to the landscape of his youth, reflecting on how this feral childhood has him still in its reins. And he forms his memories into lyrical bedtime stories populated by the both sinister and wounded Mister Mann. This Is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire takes us on the journey of a man struggling to hold himself together in prose that is raw and moving, sharp-edged and wry. Alternating literary analysis and philosophy with intimate memoir, Flynn probes his deepest ethical dilemmas. Joining Flynn in conversation this evening is Victoria Redel. Redel is the author of 3 books of poetry and 5 books of fiction, most recently the novel Before Everything. Her new collection of poems, Paradise, is forthcoming in 2022. Victoria's work has been widely anthologized, awarded, and translated. Her debut novel, Loverboy, was adapted for a feature film. Redel's short stories, poetry, and essays have appeared in Granta, the New York Times, the LA Times, Bomb, and others. She has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Fine Arts Work Center. Victoria is on the faculty of Sarah Lawrence College and lives in New York City. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question you'd like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking on the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Nick and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new memoir from us. A link to buy This Is the Night Our House Will Catch on Fire, along with a link to Victoria's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Nick, Victoria, we're thrilled to welcome you both this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here at Powell's, and thanks everyone for being here. It really means a lot for you guys to show up. And I know many of the names. Thanks for being here. I'm so glad, Victoria. It's so great to be here with you.
Normally, Nick, we would be together right now teaching, both of us, which we are doing for the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, but we'd be each in our various apartments in Provincetown teaching. And when I was thinking about this tonight, I thought, oh, each of those nights we all either give a reading or a talk. So I thought, oh, this feels kind of like normal, this time of year.
We could actually be sitting next to each other. I've seen Zoom things where people actually sit next to each other.
Oh,
we could that would be kind of weird, but
right. Oh, you mean sit in the same box together?
The same room. Yeah, we could be in the same room. Yeah.
Well, there we go. So I'm really completely excited to be able to talk to you about this book in all sorts of ways. And let's just give like a little structure to it for people, which is Nick will read about a little bit. We'll talk a little bit. Nick will read a little more. We'll talk a little more. And maybe you'll read too, because Nick is bugging me to do that.
You will read a little bit. Yes.
I'll read a little bit. And then probably 20 minutes before we end, there's that Q&A. We're all probably experts in these mechanisms. Now there's a Q&A thing at the lower part of your screen, right? Not the chat. Don't put your questions in the chat. 20 minutes before the end, I'll start to look in the Q&A and take questions. And then Nick and myself will answer them as best we can. Okay, does that seem right, Nick?
That's how. Yeah, yeah. Again, I'm just sort of stunned to be at Powell's again. I was at Powell's the last time in 2019, right, before the pandemic, and I can't believe 2 years have gone by, and it's so hard. And I just can't wait for us all to be together again. So yeah, maybe I'll read a little. Should I read a little? Did you
start
have
with
something
reading.
to say?
Yeah, that
Okay.
sounds great.
I'll read a little from the book, just a couple of brief sections to start us out, and then we'll talk a little. The book, as was said at the beginning, the structure of the book, one of the structures of the book, we'll talk about structure, I think, Victoria and I, but one of the structures is that I took 3 trips back to my hometown with my daughter when she turned 7, and then she was 8, and when she was 9, to show her places, stories that I was telling her about the town I grew up in. I wanted her to know, or she wanted to know, which I thought was very moving, that she wanted to know what my childhood was like. And as I started to tell her what it was like, the story got stranger and stranger as I remembered more and more. And a lot of it came from like being with someone who was that age, who was the age I had been in my hometown. So this fire that the book is, the title of the book is about, is something that's appeared in every one of my books, and just these little glimmers. And then in this book I decided to just go fully into it. So here's a chapter called Canopic. I'll start with this. Fire contains time. Fire is time converted into light. Fire takes trees and allows you to read other trees. The book in your hand was once a tree. Now you hold it up to the tiny fire inside the light bulb so you can read it. The words then, hopefully, create another fire in your mind. Gaston Bachelard offers this. Fire is the ultra-living element. It is intimate and it is universal. It lives in our heart. It lives in the sky. It rises from the depths of the substance and offers itself with the warmth of love. Or it can go back down into the substance and hide there, latent and pent up, like hate and vengeance. In one version of the night our house caught fire, I'm carried outside in my pajamas, left to stand across the street on the lawn of the neighbor we'd never met. In another version, my mother shakes me awake with a word, and the word is run. Or maybe she simply yells, get up, from the bottom of the stairs. Or maybe she doesn't say a word. Maybe the house is silent. Maybe it's the smoke that wakes me. In all versions, there's a lot of smoke, and I escape by running through it. I'm left on the lawn to watch the shadow of the flames on the nearby trees. 1,001 times I've told this story. Why? Because it happened. Because I escaped. Because it involves fire and firemen and sirens. Sometimes still, the story starts with just me, barefoot in the next door neighbor's yard, looking back at the house we've just tumbled out of. All I can do now is watch as it burns. Phantasmagoria. I need to freeze, make sense of the story of being 6 and running through a burning house. I need to contain it like a firefly in a jar. If I don't contain it, I don't know if I can move away from it. If I can't move away from it, I don't know if I'll ever believe I made it out in one piece. Yet here I am. I stand before you, intact, whole, holy. Everything that lives is holy. In earlier versions of the story, it was a perfect summer day. Mom and I made an apple pie. Vernon grilled sausages on the back deck. Then, after we'd all gone off to bed, after Mom, I guess, tucked me in, the raccoons came and tipped the hibachi over. The coals fanned out across the wooden planks. It was then only a matter of time. But it was always a story, like all stories, that came in several jars. Like those jars in the Egyptian wing, the Egyptians would use to hold the entrails of their dead. Canopic, lungs in one, heart in another, liver in one, spleen in another. You've seen these jars, empty now, the organs long desiccated, in the Egyptian wing of the Brooklyn Museum. I'll stop there for now.
I love that section, Nick, so much. And I love it because it seems, maybe almost all the sections in this book seem to, well, we're going to get to this, but they shimmer out to the subsequent sections. But the thing I want to talk about here is sort of are the this idea of versions of stories, which is a through line through this book, you know, but and this rhetorical gesture you do in the sentences where you say, maybe this happened, or maybe that happened, or maybe that happened, or in another version, the way I tell it is. And I love so much about that because it pushes against the urge, I think, inside of storytelling to tell a definitive story. But, you know, I want to ask you how that came about, or, you know, my guess is pretty organically, but.
Well, I think it might just be my nature too. Like I'm not a very certain person. Certainty is not sort of part of my DNA. Everything seems a little unstable and a little shifting under my feet all the time. And so, and I do enjoy that, you know, just the grammar of using conditional phrases and you know, the bringing in perhaps and maybe, and, you know, it could be this way or it could be that way. I think that for me, when I read something like that, to me, it feels more real, or at least it's more real to my experience of reality. Like you know, if ever I read something where something is sort of definitely nailed down, I always just wonder about it. I think, oh, isn't there like 1,000 other ways that could be looked at or that could be described? So I try to sort of bring that in the writing. So it is it has a lot of that sort of that unsteadiness in it. I mean, I teach my workshop that I'm teaching this week is called, you know, memoir as bewilderment. And it is, you know, and some of my students are here. Hi, everybody. Hi, are here. You know, we just met today. We met today for a couple hours. And, you know, part of that is like one of the big questions for memoir for me, which we haven't even got into. Now I'll just teach my class now is, you know, so many things happen in our lives. And the big question for any memoir, I think, is why we're writing this particular story and not like the thousands of other things that happen. What is it about this story? And to sort of not to just assume that like, well, this is my story, because you could write 100, any of us could write 100 different stories, but this is a story that somehow is for this moment of time, you know, these years or these, you know, if you're fast, these months that it takes you to write a book. I mean, it takes me years, but some people seem to write them in a month. You know, why this is a story that rises up to the surface and it demands your attention is I think one of the central questions of these books. I also just want to point out one thing, that when I read this, a little praise to editors. At the end, I had a editor at Norton who read this, and they pointed out that the canoptic jars, the ones that the deads would put the organs in, I had said that there were, you've seen these jars, lungs in one, heart in another, liver in one, a brain in the other. I said brain in the other. And this person pointed out that they wouldn't put the brain in the canoptic jars. Like the brain was considered another type of organ, and it would be stored somewhere else. I just thought that was so great to have that precision. I would have felt really badly if I had gotten that wrong. If I had put brains in a canoptic jar, and all the people that know that except for me. So that
would have said like, that guy's a fool. But there's a beautiful thing that happens inside of this section, which I think is you carry through the whole book. And, you know, you were saying something about the structure of the book being 3 trips, but there's inside of the book, there's these rhythm of structures that I think are really interesting. And one is, you know, in that section, you say, I don't know if I made it out in one piece, right? And then you say, obviously I did, I'm here telling this story. But it also seems that there's another thread inside of this book that's so, that makes the book so much more, for me, it makes the book so much more substantial than sort of the investigation and retelling of a childhood memory, which is how the burnt or fractured self did or didn't make it out of childhood in one piece. And what's even as they're bringing their child back as the dad character, you know, and what's being told and what's not being told to the child. But what we as the reader begin to learn is what what the Nick Flynn character in the side of this book struggles with inside of what it is to have not made it out what it is to have made it out, but not entirely in one piece. So I have a question for you about that, which is when you started the book, and I'm sort of half, I think we're just teaching to your class. Hopefully there are other people who are kind of writer nerds who, write books and try to figure out what do I know and what don't I know. How much did you know you were going to get into in this when you started the initial writing into these pages?
Yeah, I think it started in a real moment of like PTSD's crisis. Like it's sort of the bottom fell out of like what is referred to in trauma studies as the cover story. The story I've been telling about the fire for my whole life, which was that, our house caught on fire. And as a kid, maybe my mother said it, it seems likely she said it to get the insurance money. We were little, we all made it out. She got the insurance money, she got the house rebuilt. And to me, that was my story. It was a cover story. I told it as if a heroic story of my mother, who was a single working class mother with 3 jobs, and we had a crappy house, and it, like her boyfriend said, all it needed was a match. I mean, that's what the house needed was, and so we got it done. So to me, that was the story for a long time. That was a story I could sort of live with. And I thought it said something about my mother and I think it does say something about my mother, that her, her resourcefulness, her recklessness, her, ability to get things done, which I admire, which I definitely admire. And then it happened that, my marriage was really in trouble for reasons of my own doing. And my daughter turned 7, and it just all hit me at once. Like the fire thing hit me at the same time. And so one of the first things I wrote was this piece I just read, the canoptic piece, was one of the earlier pieces. I wrote it for the folks up at the New York State Writers Institute.
In Saratoga, New York State Writers Institute in Saratoga. Yeah.
I wrote it for them. They ended up publishing it in Salamanca.
In Salamagundi.
Salamagundi, yeah. I'm messing it all up. And I read it up there, and when I read it for the first time, this was like a long time ago, I read this piece, like I was sort of working on it, and I could barely get through it. I mean, I could not read this piece. It was like really traumatic for me. And then like, that's one thing that the writing does too. I don't know about catharsis so much, but it does sort of like, the initial wound starts to heal a little bit, it starts to sort of there's some distance from it. But the distance at that moment was very raw when I first read this. I don't know if that even answers your question.
How much did you know? So you entered into the and you walked into the gate of childhood, but how much did you? There's a sense inside of this book that the book is unfolding in the present tense of the book is unfolding in real time. At what point did you begin to decide to allow the questions about the marriage, so your own complicity in the struggles inside the marriage? Even, I want to come back to this question because it has something to do with story and cover stories, but what is the truth? The whole relationship to truth that shifts inside of the book.
That unfolding in real time is something that, I've played with that before in other books too. I think we all like to play with that. It's one of the pleasures, like in You're Before Everything, like the time, just, it's all taking place in this one very contained time of, the main character dying. And yet each character gets to go back, like travel through time, like wildly, like on each thing. But there is this present moment happening. We're moving towards something always in the book. And in mine, like the stuff in real time happening, like there were certain things happen, like I did do those 3 trips, and I did write in between those 3 trips. And the first trip was to bring my daughter back to, was it the Salt Marsh Mister Mann's house? We went to Mister Mann's house, who we talked about, which was this sort of fairy tale like figure that lived in the woods behind my grandmother's. And I would go, I would spend, I was told after the summer after our house caught fire or was set on fire, I was told that I couldn't go near his house. If I did, he'd come out with a shotgun and shoot me. And when I heard that he'd shoot me with rock salt, which wouldn't kill me, but it would just really sting, I just spent the entire summer trying to get as close as I could to his house to get him to shoot me. I was trying to get him to shoot me with a shotgun. And some people I tell that to, and they think it makes no sense at all. And to other people, that makes perfect sense. That's a perfect way to spend your summer. I think you probably would have spent your summer that way, Victoria. So that was the first year, was to go to Mr. Mann's house and tell the story of Mr. Mann. That was the story. And she really wanted to hear about Mr. Mann. She was fascinated by the idea of this guy, this person. And the house still stands, like strangely, almost like a dream. The house is now a museum. And so a house that he was like in his 90s, this guy who had lived there, was the oldest house in maybe New England. It was like from 1630s, this really ancient old house that the family lived in it until he died. And then it became a museum. And now, so I got to go in it once when I was like her age, 7, and then once like 50 years later with her when she's 7, to go back into it again. It was just very, very, there were a lot of things like that kept happening. Like, once you sort of enter into a project and you're open to it, I think things just unfold that way,
Yeah, no, that's a crazy part inside of a project. Like, you think the world starts just kind of becoming more and more like available. And you're like, whoa, I didn't think that could happen. I didn't think that could happen.
You just make these connections and these patterns appear and these connections that are, I guess, always there. But, like we went back to the house, the last one we went back to, the second trip was to the salt marsh that I spent a lot of time in, the saltwater marsh. And so I wanted to take her there and spend time in the salt marsh. And which is just, to me, it's my definition of a landscape. If I think of a landscape, I think of a salt marsh. Like, that's like, other people have mountains or prairies or something. Mine is a salt marsh. I was just in it in Provincetown, just, I had to tear myself away to come, to leave Provincetown. And the third one was to go back into the house that was set on fire, that was odd. That was so strange. So I knocked on the door. We just went in. We just walked in with my daughter. I just knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I used to live here." And he knew who I was. He just invited me in and we showed me the whole house. Yeah, it's very strange.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Nick, before we talk about more, can you read a little more?
Sure. And then maybe you'll read a little something.
Sure.
So I was thinking of reading this other little piece which connects to what I just read. Maybe I'll read this other one though. 231. That has little ideas. You can skip around a little. So this goes into a little bit. The book starts with, it's called kintsugi, which you'll know what it is. If you don't, you probably already know what it is. But I describe what it is anyway. But it talks about these stones that were on my desk. The book starts with these stones on my desk, which my daughter had taken from the beach I took her to, which is right by the salt marsh. And so the stones appear in Peggotty Beach, is the beach where they're on in my hometown. My daughter learns kintsugi. My daughter learns how my mother died by seeing the title of one of my poems. On the anniversary of my mother's suicide, my daughter and I take the A train to the Museum of Natural History. I hadn't meant for her to see it. For some reason, I burst into tears when she asked if it's true. Maybe from grief, maybe from relief. I knew that one day I'd tell her. I just didn't expect it to be today. It's better, I need to keep reminding myself, to be living in the truth. This is why, for the past 3 years, each week I bring Dr. Me my dreams. In one, I hug a boy who is the age I was the summer our house caught fire. He is my son, but he is limp in my arms. I tell him I love him, but we both know it is a lie. Later, I see him in a motel room under crumpled bed sheets, which are covered in blood. The sheets rustle slightly, but I do not move toward him. I do nothing to help him, nothing at all. In another, more recent dream, a broken piece of pottery, blue and gold, sits on my desk. My initials are on it from the year I got sober the first time. It reminds Dr. Me of kintsugi, the Japanese method of repairing broken pottery using gold to bind the pieces together. In this way, the break becomes what is beautiful, what is valued. It is a way to embrace the flaw, the imperfect. In place of the break, there is now a vein of gold. Yesterday, I offered one of the stones my daughter had carried from Peggotty Beach to a woman who had lived through a fire Her house had caught fire when she was a child. She had escaped, but not unharmed. We were in a writing workshop together. I was writing this. I had brought one of the stones with me to remind me what I wanted to write about. Back home, the rest are still on my desk, so heavy, pushing down in the air. I cannot say why they are still there, taking up so much space, except that they mean something. I wonder if my mother, as she carried her body to the edge of the ocean, as she crossed into it, could see how these stones contain both time and the slow erasure of time, how each is 15 green bottles with nothing inside. I asked the woman who had lived through fire what I should do with this one stone. Her eyes were radiant, like fading coals. Scars rose up her neck like flames. The fire had not taken her words. I showed her a picture of my daughter, told her the story of how she had filled the trunk of my car with stones. One day my daughter will likely get a tattoo, I told her, or a piercing, or a real scar, one that doesn't go away, one that she will carry for the rest of her days. I told this woman that if I prayed, I would ask for my daughter, for all of us to be protected, not from all harm, but from the after effects of that harm. The woman who had lived through a fire smiled, held the stone like a child in her lap, offered to take care of it for me until I was better.
Love these sections.
I had a little hidden, like a, what do you call it, an Easter egg or something hidden in that poem. There's a line from my first book of poems in there, which I just inserted in.
What's the line?
How each is 15 green bottles with nothing inside. That's from my first book of poems. I just sort of like that line, and it's, you know,
I've done that. I've done that and pulled lines from older.
You know, you steal from yourself. You just steal liberally from yourself.
Nick, one of the things I so admire, and I think anyone who, this is my plug for your book, anyone who buys the book tonight and reads it will be struck by, I think you can't help but be struck by this in the book, is the kind of freedom and permission you give yourself to enter into areas that are difficult and shameful, and utterly human, you know. So, you know, anyone who's had a long-term relationship and managed their way through the intricacies of that, and the ways in which any of us might have been deficient or fucked up or dragged our pasts with us and redone them, or strayed from our relationships and given us ourselves stories, you know, that I think that desire to kind of write into that world is present for a lot of people who want to write. And yet, you know, the shame, the creatures who sit on your shoulder and say, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, oh my God, what will people think if you do that? It feels to me like you worked really hard in this book to keep, you know, it's an unfolding, because inside of this book, there's also sections in which you're not aware, right? And you allow yourself to be in the place where you're less aware. But the book is a book about a kind of a building awareness. And I guess the first thing I want to say is I admire it. And, you know, as someone who's lived a life, I admire it. And I want to kind of ask you a little bit about the tricks of courage, because certainly as a teacher, you know, I feel like I'm always trying to first ask people, what are the things that draw them to write, and what are the things that they're afraid to write? And usually they're the same things. It's like shame, you know, comes up as a wall. And I just want you to talk about
I
that.
just want to say too, I mean, you've been there yourself with your writing. I mean, I think back to Loverboy, to your first book, with the mother, you know, does she kill the child? She wants to kill the child. Like, it's just like this sort of.
She tries to kill them both, but
she tries to kill them both. Yeah, it was just like this. I mean, I was just stunned by that book, just like that. You know, going into that mind and like being in it. It's an amazing book. You know, all of you who have not yet experienced Loverboy. yeah, the way I do it, the way I've always done it, everything I've written, I feel I'm doing something completely wrong whenever I'm writing anything. And I told my students today, I said, like, if you're feeling like you're right in the right place, if you feel like, at least for me, like if I feel like I'm doing something right, it's usually terrible. It's usually just terrible. I feel like, oh yeah, I nailed that. It's always like the next day I look at it, I'm like, this is just nothing. This is nothing. But when I get to that place of like, I'm over my head and I'm just really like, oh, I really shouldn't be writing this. I'll go a little bit further into something and be like, I have to turn back. That's where, like, for me, that's where interesting things happen, where I'm just really on that edge of discomfort. And I don't know if it's shame. Like, I'm not sure. I might be like shameless or something. I'm not sure, but I just like, my thing is that I don't really believe or expect anyone to read the book. And like, while I'm writing it, I don't think anyone's going to read it. Like, I just tell myself, it's like when swimming in Provincetown, like I completely believe 100% I will not be eaten by a shark. And it just allows me to swim. It allows me to swim in the ocean because I completely have convinced myself I will not. And when I'm writing, I convince myself no one's ever going to read this. So that allows me the freedom to do it. Like, I can't imagine if you think about your audience, like that thing about that old maxim of like, think of your audience when you're writing. What a terrible thing to say. Like, I don't know who came up with that. Like, who is your audience?
Well, if you write, as I think both of us tend to do, trying to find, I don't know if you can use this word, the best place of jeopardy or the most disequilibrium that you can have, then it's hard to think about your audience, except for that you have to believe your audience has been alive on the earth and has lived, a complicated, is a fellow traveler on the earth and isn't pretending not to be.
Yeah, that's the thing about readers in general, is like they're an open bunch. People aren't going to books generally, at least the books that we like. They're not going to them with expecting just to be entertained or to be lulled quietly into sleep or something. It's an active experience. Like, for me, like, art is the art I return to is an active experience rather than a passive experience, and it forces me to be also engaged and unsteady, and and also having strange emotional firestorms at the same time.
Let me switch things a little bit to ask you another question. I know beyond thinking this, I know this to be true about both of us a bit in terms of our work, how we write, but how did you put this book? I mean, it feels collage together. Like, it did not start at page, like when you said I wrote the canopic section, which comes in, where does that come in? I forget what page that is.
Page 62.
Page 62. So that's so are you writing sections and then literally kind of collaging them together on your floor? How do you start to do that?
Yeah.
A writer nerd question and there were a lot of people going writer nerds unite. So
and feel free to start putting questions in. Well, I'll answer this question and maybe Victoria will read a short passage and we'll do questions. How does that sound? So writing this, like I write things, I write passages and I write them like sections, and I sort of, at a certain point, in the process, usually 2 or 3 years into it, I can see the holes. I can see that it needs to have something. I needed to have I wanted to like to be in my mother's head, or maybe I didn't want to be in my mother's head, but the writing sort of started to be in that. So there's a whole section of being in the supermarket where she works and making donuts in the morning, and wanting her to sort of, to be, I wanted to be in her consciousness when she's dating. She's like 20 years old and she has 2 kids, and like she just has these boyfriends, and the boyfriends sort of come and they see this beautiful woman like at 5 in the morning making donuts, and they come and she had various boyfriends when I was growing up that I knew. And these guys, I knew a lot of them. They were all like these really working class guys, like the carpenters. They worked at the concrete pipe company, and they were in fishing boats, and they were these guys that would, the guy that she was with when the house burned down, he was the guy that built the house again, that rebuilt it. so that was that took a while, like to get that section took a while to enter into my mother's mind. So that was like a whole period of time doing that. And then there are other times I just, section where I'm thinking about me, what I was doing outside of my family, like going to camp and like being at camp and trying to imagine that time, like what I was doing outside of, after the fire, before the fire and after the fire. So there were all these sort of structural things to lay out. And then I did a whole chart, which I don't have right now in front of me. I wish I had the image pulled up right in front of me, but it was I had a residency and I put a huge sheet of paper on the wall and drew a line across the center of it. And each chapter was like a musical score. And each chapter would have like what was tangible, like what the tangible stuff, like an apple pie, and what was the sort of subconscious connection underneath, like what the dream was underneath that. And I sort of like, if there was a lot of apple pie in it, say, just as an example, it would be high up. So it'd be mostly that, just a little bit of the subconscious. And then if it was more subconscious, I wanted to like keep that modulation going, to keep the pulse going through the piece. So if it went too much into the subconscious realm, I knew I had to come out into like the grounded reality afterwards. So that was a whole structural thing at the very end to put all these pieces together. That was like I had to make a map of it. I had to make like a score to understand it. Yeah.
Cool. That's great. Thanks.
Our friend Bill Clegg like now has that score. He wants to like put it on his wall or something. Yeah.
Huh.
So Bill has the score. And now we're going to hear a little bit from Victoria, but now's the time to, some questions are appearing, but let's hear a little bit from Victoria, then we'll go into questions.
So this is from this novel, Before Everything, and it's sort of maybe interesting to pair with Nick's book, because when I first thought anything, when I first started writing any pages into this, I thought I was actually going to try writing a memoir for the first time about a friendship that had endured in always present tense for, I don't know, more than 45 years or something. We met when we were 7. And I realized I kind of couldn't, my friend had passed away, and I realized I couldn't do it because to write that memoir meant to say things about her life, family, that she would not have wanted said. And they weren't meaningful. So anyway, I turned to fiction, which is what I wrote anyway. And I thought at first I was going to write a book that had 2 characters that was sort of going to go between these 2 best friends. And then by the time the book ended, it's in 3rd person, but I had sort of 18 characters whose consciousness I was interested in. The sort of setting of the book, just to say this before I read a little section, is it's a woman who has a whole group of childhood friends, a whole group of adult friends, a community she lives in, and after several episodes of illness, she's decided to stop treatment. And so the book sort of revolves around the eventuality of that, but also how people live with other people's choices is sort of the thing. So I'll just read one little section. This a section early in the book called Secret. Days earlier, the eldest boy was alone in the room with her. Mama, he held her hand. She nodded her head to show she was awake. Mom, I have a secret to tell you. She smiled. He was her first child, now a grown man. Oh, those years she'd spent unnecessarily worrying about Julian. Shy boy, the one to play at the corner of the schoolyard where the pavement yielded to weedy scrub. A boy poking sticks into dirt, serious and happy and unworried about kids whizzing past him. Got you, they screamed, tagging a shoulder, not his. At pickup, she'd ached watching him happy alone. She wanted him to be in the center of the playing fields, calling teams, the one named captain. Now, here he was, a gentleman, still quiet, with a boy's stuttery laugh, still happiest in the woods, foraging for black morels and ramps. Mom, Julian said again, I have a secret. She nodded. Can you open your eyes? She'd do anything for him. Her eyes were so heavy, nickel-lidded, heavier even than the given doses, heavy with some thickness she could feel weighted in her bones and her blood. She opened her eyes. Beautiful. It was her father's face he wore, that halo of curly dark hair. The light was behind him. She saw the lace of the curtains, and through the curtains, the trees of the yard, her lace, her window with the crystal hanging on filament, and the yard where her 3 children had played, so slightly hers, any of it anymore. Yes, baby, he said, we're having a baby. There was a rush, happiness left for the having. Even in these last days, she'd felt happiness, momentary, sometimes sharp, almost like pain. Here, though, was the apex. We don't want anyone to know, not yet, but we want you to know. The baby of her first baby. She had loved the shape of him unborn inside of her so much that when she came to full term, she'd hoped for a long birth, wanting, she said, for each moment to be exceptional, hers to savor. And then the joke for years with friends was that after hours into her labor, curled into some jagged harbor of agony, she'd begged for drugs. But at the end, there was this child, perfect lips, hands, feet, and she was forever changed. She sat up in the bed and kissed her son. You'll be a wonderful father, she whispered. She kept a hand at his shoulder and looked at him, working to make her face clear and direct. She wanted him to have this, his mother beholding the father he was becoming. There was wind through the window, spring air, a last best secret. She smiled. I won't tell a soul.
I love that. I love that you read that passage. It's got such the poetry in it of, Victoria's a poet also, obviously. And just that those lines of the nickel eyes and the, I was talking about with my students today too, about how much we can stay within a scene of like, deep trauma, and like just that thing of like the gaze looking out the window, like looking out into the yard and seeing the things in the yard, and sort of like that grounds us as readers. And then we get to come back to the scene, and then this secret gets revealed. And also the I just love in the book where in each character, like we're in their heads, and the main character who is dying, who is on morphine, a lot of morphine. Like we just have this, it's just this trippy sort of like
She gets
reality.
trippier through the book.
Yeah, it keeps getting trippier and trippier, but it's just like things are not really coherent, or seeing things and not seeing things, and just letting that be, the consciousness is filtered through these drugs into it. It's really, really a pleasure. It's such a great book. Such a beautiful book.
She starts doing math problems through a lot of the book at one point. Let me, I think we're going to take some questions.
Okay.
We have a lot of questions. Okay, Natasha's question. I love the name Natasha. That's my mother's name, Natasha. How do you manage the shift into the mother's voice, Nick?
Yeah, let me see how I did that, because it was tricky, like because that's the thing, it is a question if you're writing a memoir, how do you get into it? And I'm looking at it right now, and I put it in italics, and I write, she thinks. I begin with, I have the key, my mother thinks, I let myself in. This is in the supermarket. Inside, she moves to the darkness. So it goes from first person to third person. And then in the italic, then right before she says anything, it says, she thinks, I'm here to make the donuts. Donuts are my job. So I do it very obviously. It's a very and I had to figure that out because like my editor was like, I don't know, why are these Italian, who's talking? They didn't understand who was talking. So I had to really make it clear, okay, I'm in my mother's consciousness now when talking. And it was sort of an easy fix. It might've been more graceful without it, but I think it was like necessary just so that we wouldn't stumble over it. I wanted people to know whose mind we're in at that. So yeah, thanks, Natasha. We'll see you tomorrow, Natasha.
Heather's asking, what do our daily writing practices look like? Nick, you want to take that first?
Well, for the last year, I've been in a writing group with these wonderful writers, which is really amazing. One of them is Victoria Redel, and another one is Donna Massini, who I see in the audience also, who just asked a question. So we meet once a week, and that's really an important thing. My whole thing is that I think it's the same as a meditation practice. Like meditation, to have a meditation practice, you have to have a sangha, the dharma, and the daily practice, which is the meditation. And the Dharma is like the text that you read, the books. And for us, we read other people's work. We read other poets and other writers. And the Sangha is the group. You have to have all three, and the Sangha is the group. And I've really, this has really been a great benefit, one of the great joys of COVID, of the pandemic, is that we've come together and done this. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
I'll just add to it. I was writing before I had kids, but I had kids kind of early on, and a job, and I thought, oh, I'm going to lose this writing thing. This is going to be really like the illegitimate baby that everyone says, like, oh, that's so cute, but do you have to take care of it? And so the only way I knew how to do that is to sort of really structure my life, so whatever's going on, whether I have, whether I'm teaching or whatever I'm doing, I make a really rigid kind of schedule for myself and sort of rigidly create time to work. It may not be a daily practice. I lots of time don't have a daily practice, but I try to schedule in X number of days where I have a certain amount of time. And then even if those periods of time get screwed up, I have the any amount counts theory that is the addendum to it, which is like, oh, I have to go to the dentist. And so it screws up the 2 hours, but I still have 30 minutes. So I do that 30 minutes. So let me take Danielle's question. In the contemplative tradition, there's a phrase, transcend and include. Oh, I love that. Meaning that we transcend the old things we don't need from one stage in our lives, and we include the things that are vital to creativity, living, etc. How do you feel you have transcended and included in this work? What do you feel has carried on from earlier works, and what do you feel you have transcended?
Yeah, so it's a heavy question. That's like,
yeah, Danielle, you're in it. That's it.
Yeah. So what I think of when I hear this, the transcend and include, like from one book to another, like in my earlier books, there's a real sense, like I think there's a real sense, like in my earlier book, that I had a sense as a writer that if I could get, and I think I even say this, if I could get the story right, I thought that it would actually, my beloveds would rise again from the dead, and they would stand before me again, that I would have them, I would have them sort of materially before me. And then like, I've sort of like realized that that's not the way the world works. And that's not why I write now. Now it is almost to be, it's always a moving into being more present in the world, and not to sort of, hold on to that, those things. I mean, so that's why the new book is like, it's so much about my daughter, about this, like, it really is about the relationship with my daughter in many ways, and, repairing things with my wife. And, those are sort of the main points of the story, but it goes back to trying to understand it from, who my mother was when she was younger. And what I get from her is like so much, like her, I love her recklessness. I love her wildness, and I love her fierceness, just this fierceness, and her humor and her weirdness, are really, precious to me. But that sort of the self-destructive nature is something I had to transcend. So I sort of say that, yeah. Thank you, Danielle.
Nick, this is from our beloved Donna Massini, beautiful poet. As someone who has the privilege and joy to read both of your works in progress, Donna's in our writing group, to see the ways in which you both work piece by piece collagely, that's good, Donna. How long before you begin to have a sense of where in the whole these pieces might come, and how many ways in which they might be ordered?
Yeah. I don't worry about that for a while. Like I sort of, take my time. Like the last memoir before this was like a long time ago, like, I don't know, 9 years ago or something. I think the last memoir I wrote. And I didn't write for a while, like for quite a while after that last memoir, I didn't write for a couple of years really. And so this one started, it took me like 6 years to do. So it was the gathering. I really enjoy all the phases of it, but I really enjoy the gathering phase of just sort of like not knowing where I'm going, and not even having a sense of a project really. And then suddenly it starts to sort of click together. Suddenly the pieces start to talk to each other. Like there's a lot of fire in this. Okay, the fire seems to be a main thing, and there's this, my child is asking me questions about my childhood. Oh yeah, our house caught fire, and it all sort of came together, but very organically, and I just sort of let it happen by doing that daily writing practice, and then it came together. It does. There is that, like, Frank Bedard is one of our touchstones in our workshop now. He's been invoked many times with his idea of the pulse, and now also the idea of the inevitable. At some point, things fall together and they feel inevitable. They feel like that's the way they have to fit together. And then, but you try to be very delicate. I try to be very delicate with that. Yeah.
What would I add to that? I think well, with my first book, I didn't know what I was doing. I'd been a poet and then a short story writer, and now I was trying to write a novel. And, literally when I first told somebody what I thought the novel was about, they said, well, don't write that because it will never be published. And I thought, oh my God, they're probably right. They'd written a bunch of books, and I thought, shit, I'm not going to write that. But then of course I was going to write it because I was, it was what I needed and wanted to write. And I didn't know how to do it. And so I would just write into sections, just write little moments, write scenes, vignettes, little kind of poems is what they seem like to me, except prose. And I knew, for example, like this is an example I've thought of before. At one point, the mother and the son are looking out the window of their house, and nobody else had entered the book in my mind, or these sections. And I thought, the kid who mows the lawn shows up, because they have a house, they have a lawn. And so some neighborhood kid shows up, and I write this scene of them spying on him. And then some other day later, I thought, well, I don't know what to write about today. I don't know what to do. And I thought, if you have a kid come and mow your lawn, that happens a lot, right? So he's a character now, because I've included him. I have to return to him. So whatever things, I want to call them objects, but sometimes those objects were people, they became stuff that I would continue to return to. I wouldn't know where they would necessarily fit. And literally in that book, I just kept folders called things like lawn boy, in the house, out of the house, and I would just, because I wanted to feel like I was having a project and I wasn't just a total failure, I would print them out and put them in my folders. And then at a certain point, I started to get a sense of something. And then I started seeing what I hadn't put into the book, and where else I could go. What I'd been omitting became clear to me, and I started to write into that.
I'm thinking now, I wonder if I don't know if I would have written this book, This Is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire, if I hadn't read, Loverboy, whenever that was, that really was, it opened some doors.
You once said such a sweet thing to me, Nick. We were in Provincetown, and it was the first night that you and I had just met Mark Adams, and we had dinner together, you and Mark and I, and you were living on Tasha Hill. And you said to me, after I read Loverboy, I sort of figured something out. And so when I was writing, I put the word Loverboy and tacked it above my desk. And I thought, wow, that's great. Because after I wrote, I was so embarrassed, like thinking you're supposed to know how to do something that I didn't know how to do. And I remember going once to at the New York State Writers Institute, Bob Boyers was interviewing me, and the book had come out, and he said, tell me a little bit about your process. And by then I had a book, so I didn't feel quite as embarrassed. And I said a little bit about collaging it. And he said to me, well, that's interesting, because Michael Ondaatje was here last week, and he talks about writing in the exact same way. And I love Michael Ondaatje's work. So I felt like, I'm not just such a beginner weirdo, that is a way to write. So
we're getting close to the end. We should maybe just ask maybe one question more, and then we'll go back to the
Nick, let me just say before we do the questions, there's a lot of just thank yous. beautiful woman Elizabeth says, a thank you, reading another bullshit night. Its form and its teeny tiny use of the word I was what I needed as an inspiration. My memoir was then published a year or so after I read it. Many thanks.
Wow.
So that's
Well,
really nice.
I have to look for her memoir, Elizabeth Scott.
So Terrence wrote, I love the idea of bewilderment and the process of discovery in the writing. I'm curious how this process might feel and look in poetry, where the writing is more condensed. You want to talk about that? Do you write poems while writing longer forms, or are they separate practices for you?
I write both at the same time. Like most of my books have a sibling. The prose has a poetry sibling, because they both take, over the course of those years, the 5 or 6 years it takes to write them. I'm toggling back and forth, and sometimes for months I'm in poetry world, and sometimes I'm in prose. And often they're dealing with the same subject. They're sort of wrestling with the same subject, just in these different forms. And so they, they are very different. The forms are different, but they do, they sort of grow organically together in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, and Taryn, just to give you the opposite side of things, I tend to really separate the two, because although if I'm writing fiction, I tend to really write fiction for a period of time. And if I'm writing poems, I often will be gathering kind of notes on a book I want to write, but I avoid it because the rhythms feel kind of different for me, and I can tend in fiction to be overly compressed. So I want to kind of avoid that, which the poem will do exactly what you're saying, where it's condensed. But that said, every time I've come out of writing a novel, I'm always so psyched to go back to poems, like, oh, that's just little and short. And then of course I remember how damn hard it is to write a good poem. But I also find that I have been writing poems kind of without really realizing I've been writing poems in my writer's notebook all the way through. So there's a little bit of difference.
We should probably end there. I just want to say goodbye to a couple of folks. I think that's a beautiful place to end. But Anatoly Molotovkov. I'm sorry for messing up your last name. Can you say that last name? Anatoly. Let's say Anatoly M.
Molotov. I'm trying.
I owe you an email. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out you sent me a question. We'll figure that out. And Andrea Sizdik put something in the mail today. People have asked for. I've offered a signed bookplate, so anyone who wants them, if you just send me an email, I'll send you a signed bookplate. And yours are in the mail, Andrea.
And I'm pretty sure that you can go to Powell's and buy Nick's book, which would be awesome.
Yeah.
And you're back. Yeah.
Hello again. I just put the link to buy Nick's latest book in the chat again. And Victoria and Nick's books are also in the chat at the beginning of the night. Nick and Victoria, I just want to say thank you so much for being here and for the great conversation. You got many thanks from the writer nerds in the chat this evening, which was fun to see. Thank you to everyone who joined us for the event as well. And please consider purchasing a copy of Nick's book by visiting us on pals.com. While you're there, be sure to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events, and we look forward to seeing you at another event very soon. Nick and Victoria, thank you again. We're very grateful that you were here this evening. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.